In the grand halls of forgotten mansions, the walls remember what the living have long tried to bury. Behind polished silver and candlelit dinners, some families hid more than just secrets. They hid rituals. The Wexleys were one such family. Wealth dripped from their hands, but so did something else, something far colder than gold. Tonight, we open the doors to a house where the guests of honor never left the table. The Wexley fortune was not born from labor or invention, but from a single inexplicable twist of fate that reshaped the destiny of a dying family. In the early 1830s, London was a place of soot and sorrow, where wealth was worshipped and desperation lived in every alleyway. Among the struggling aristocracy stood the Wexleys, a family whose lineage stretched back centuries, though by that time their name was worth little more than the paper it was printed on. Their grand townhouse in Bloomsbury had begun to crumble, the chandeliers dimmed, the servants dismissed, and the air thick with the quiet humiliation of decline. Henry Wexley, the patriarch, was a man haunted by failure. He had inherited a legacy of debts, false promises, and empty halls echoing with the ghosts of better days. His wife, Eleanor, kept to her chambers, her mind unraveling under the strain of hunger and shame. Their two children, Edmund and Clara, were too young to understand the weight of ruin, but old enough to feel it in the hollow silence of every meal. It was during one of those bleak winters that a visitor came to their door, a tall, thin man in a black coat who introduced himself as Mr. Avery. He claimed to represent a consortium of foreign investors interested in purchasing rare antiques from struggling British families. Henry, desperate and prideful, at first refused, but the man's manner of speaking was strange, persuasive, and oddly comforting. He spoke of fortune, of opportunity, of redemption for the Wexley name. Before the night was over, a document was signed. No one saw what ink it was written in, nor could Henry recall the precise terms the next morning. All he remembered was Mr. Avery's final words echoing through the empty parlour. "The dead must dine with the living, and the living shall never want." Within weeks, the Wexley fortune changed. The debts that had chained them for years vanished without explanation. Land titles once disputed were returned to their possession. A vein of silver was discovered on their neglected countryside property, and their investments, long stagnant, suddenly began to flourish. London society took notice. Invitations poured in once again. The Wexleys hosted grand dinners under candlelight, filling their halls with laughter and music that had been silent for years. Yet among the glittering faces and flowing wine, an unease settled like dust. Guests whispered that the family seemed changed, too pale, too watchful, as if their smiles were painted on. Some swore the same man in black attended every gathering, never speaking, never eating, simply observing from the far end of the table. Henry Wexley became a figure of fascination and fear. He was seen often walking alone at night through the fog, stopping in churchyards and speaking softly as though to the earth itself. Rumors spread that he had found something ancient, something powerful beneath his country estate. When questioned, he only smiled and said, "The family is whole again." His wife, Eleanor, was rarely seen after that winter. When she did appear, she wore mourning veils, though no death had been announced. Servants quit without explanation, claiming they heard voices whispering their names from behind locked doors. One maid reportedly saw Eleanor dining alone one night, except she was not alone. The shadows seated around her were shaped like men, though none had faces. By 1836, the Wexleys were among the richest families in London, but their fortune carried a chill that never seemed to lift. Clara was married off to a banker twice her age, but her wedding was marked by strange omens. The candles at the altar would not stay lit, and the church bells rang without hands upon them. Edmund, the heir, began showing signs of the same quiet madness that had claimed his mother. He spoke to empty chairs, raised toasts to invisible guests, and wandered the crypt beneath their country home for hours at a time. The family's gatherings grew smaller, more secretive. Invitations ceased. The windows of the Bloomsbury house were shuttered, and carriages arrived only at night. Those who passed by swore they could hear music still, soft, slow, and mournful, drifting from within, the same tunes that had played during their first feast of renewal. Some said they saw silhouettes moving behind the curtains, heads bowed as if in prayer or reverence. Others claimed to have seen Henry himself years after his supposed death, seated at the long dining table, pale and unmoving, surrounded by those he had once called family. No one could explain how the Wexleys had managed to keep their wealth through the decades of turmoil that followed, how their estates remained untouched through war, plague, and fire. It was as though the fortune itself was bound by something unseen, something that fed upon more than coin. The contract, it was said, was never found, though rumors of it persisted for generations. A single page sealed with dark wax and an emblem shaped like a raven's eye. The surviving descendants denied its existence, yet none of them could escape the same chilling legacy, each born into wealth, each touched by a quiet dread, each hearing the faint sound of cutlery and laughter in the walls when they dined alone. The Wexleys' rise from poverty to unholy prosperity became one of London's most whispered tales, a story passed between servants and scholars alike, always ending in a question none dared to answer. The Wexley dinners became a thing of legend among those who dared to speak of them. To outsiders, they were gatherings of refinement and luxury, attended by the finest of London's elite, where crystal glasses clinked under chandeliers and violins sang through the marble halls. But to those who had been inside and lived to whisper about it, there was something profoundly wrong in the way the family celebrated. The air felt too still, the laughter too hollow, the warmth of the fire never quite enough to chase away the creeping cold that clung to every corner of the room. Every Thursday evening, without fail, the Wexleys hosted their banquet, and though invitations were once sought after, they eventually became an invitation few were brave enough to accept. The long oak table stretched beneath portraits of ancestors that seemed to watch every guest with knowing eyes. At the head sat Henry Wexley, the patriarch, now older and thinner, with a fixed smile that rarely reached his eyes. His children, Edmund and Clara, took their places opposite him, their skin pale as wax and their movements delicate, as if afraid to disturb something unseen. The servants moved with quiet precision, never meeting anyone's gaze, and when the wine was poured, its dark surface reflected something deeper than candlelight. Yet the true horror of these gatherings was not the food or the people seated in the light, but those who sat in the shadows. It was said that certain chairs at the Wexley table were never empty, even when no one occupied them. They were polished daily, set with silverware and fine china, their plates filled and refilled throughout the evening. Some guests claimed that the air above these chairs shimmered faintly, as if the light bent around invisible forms. Others swore they saw pale outlines of figures seated there, hands folded, eyes sunken, faces still and grey. One woman, a visiting duchess, left the estate in hysterics after she swore she saw the late Eleanor Wexley, who had been declared dead 2 winters prior, seated calmly at her husband's right hand, a faint smile upon her lips as she lifted an empty glass to toast the room. After that night, fewer and fewer guests returned. The Wexleys did not seem to notice. Their gatherings continued with the same ritual precision. The table was always set for 13, regardless of who attended, and a place was always left open near the head, an empty seat that was never spoken of. The servants, when questioned, refused to comment. One butler was overheard muttering that the family would not dine alone, that the contract required company from both sides of the veil. What that meant? No one could say. The next morning, the man was gone, his quarters empty, his name never mentioned again. Neighbors began to whisper that strange deliveries were made to the house at odd hours of the night. Wooden crates carried into the cellar, heavy and sealed, leaving a trail of damp earth on the marble floors. The stench of formaldehyde sometimes drifted through the halls, masked by the sweet perfume of lilies that adorned the dining table. When asked, Edmund would only smile and say they were preserving family heirlooms. But the truth was far more grotesque. In the years that followed, those who managed to glimpse the Wexley dining hall up close claimed the family had begun dining with the dead in a manner more literal than anyone had believed possible. Behind the heavy drapes, the temperature never rose above a chill. The bodies of deceased relatives were seated at the table, dressed in their finest attire, their faces painted with care to mimic the glow of the living. They were adorned with jewels, gloves on skeletal hands, wigs covering the thinning hair of decay. The Wexleys spoke to them as though they were still alive, raising glasses and sharing stories, laughter echoing into the void. The servants maintained them, cleaning, perfuming, stitching them together when time began to unmake what was left. It was a grotesque pantomime of life, an eternal dinner that defied the natural order. The family believed these gatherings ensured their prosperity. Henry often quoted an old phrase to his children before each meal began: "Fortune feasts where death is fed." The ritual, he claimed, must never be broken, for their wealth was bound to the presence of their ancestors. The silver mines that filled their coffers had begun to dry, yet somehow the family's fortune only grew. It was as if something unseen replenished it, something fed by their ghastly devotion. Visitors noticed that the mirrors in the dining room were all covered in black cloth, save for one cracked glass behind Henry's chair, in which the reflections of the guests seemed wrong, lagging, twisting, or missing altogether. As the years passed, the dinners became more elaborate and less human. The Wexleys no longer invited outsiders. They dined among themselves and those they had once buried. When a family member died, they did not hold funerals. Instead, the dining table gained another guest. Clara, now grown and pale as moonlight, began speaking to the corpses as if they answered her. Edmund kept meticulous records of each dinner, noting the temperature of the room, the number of candles lit, and the scent of the lilies. He claimed the dead could hear them only if the rituals were exact. The servants, fearful and broken, obeyed without question. A few tried to flee the estate, but were brought back, always brought back, and forced to serve at one final supper before they too vanished. In time, the family's fortune became secondary to their obsession. Meals stretched through the night into dawn, and the living seemed to fade into the same stillness as their decaying companions. The music that once filled the halls was replaced by a haunting silence broken only by the faint scrape of cutlery and the murmured voices of people who should no longer speak. To those few who caught sight of the estate's windows at night, it appeared that the entire house flickered between life and death, between the present and some other darker place. And though the Wexleys believed their ritual preserved them, their mansion had already become their tomb long before the world realized what had taken root within its walls. Beneath the Wexley estate lay the secret heart of their rituals, a place carved in stone and shadow where light could never linger for long. The entrance was hidden behind a wall in the wine cellar, sealed by a mechanism that only Henry and later his son Edmund could open. To those few who stumbled upon it, it appeared as nothing more than an old servant's passage. But to the family, it was a sacred threshold, the doorway between the living and the dead. The corridor sloped downward into the earth, lined with damp brick and the faint scent of mildew mixed with something far more metallic. At the end of the passage stood an iron door engraved with unfamiliar symbols, worn smooth by the touch of generations. Beyond that door lay the chamber the Wexleys called the House of Eternal Company, a crypt-turned-dining hall built to host the family's most forbidden gatherings. The chamber was enormous, larger than any room above it, its arched ceiling supported by stone pillars etched with names of the dead. Along the walls stood glass cases filled with relics, rings, hair combs, wedding bands, bits of bone carefully displayed beneath candlelight that never seemed to burn out. In the center stood the table, the same size and shape as the one in their dining room above, but carved from black marble veined with streaks of silver. Around it were 12 chairs, each adorned with carvings of skeletal hands and weeping faces. The air in that place was cold enough to miss the breath, and yet the candles never flickered. The Wexleys claimed it was where their ancestors listened, where the boundary between the world of flesh and the world of memory grew thin enough to speak across. When Henry first began holding dinners there, he called it an act of reverence. He would lead his family down the hidden stairs on nights when storms clawed at the windows above, carrying trays of food and bottles of aged wine. They would dine in silence for the first course, a moment of offering to those who had passed before them. Then Henry would read aloud from an ancient book bound in cracked leather, its pages filled with what appeared to be prayers, but read more like invocations. He insisted these recitations kept the family's fortune alive, that their ancestors blessed their wealth so long as they were honored with these feasts. As the years passed, however, the practice changed. The prayers grew longer, the silence heavier, and the guests more numerous. It began with portraits. The family brought paintings of their dead into the chamber, hanging them along the walls so that they might watch. Then came possessions, rings, clothing, the preserved hands of ancestors kept as relics. But soon the paintings were replaced by bodies. The first to be brought down was Eleanor Wexley, Henry's wife, whose body had been kept hidden from burial under the guise of mourning. Her corpse was cleaned, dressed and seated at the table as if she had never left. Henry insisted it was necessary for the ritual, that her presence sealed their connection with the spirits of the past. When Edmund asked how his mother could guide them while she sat so still, Henry replied that the dead had many ways of speaking and that the living had only to listen. Over time, the chamber filled with figures, uncles, cousins, ancestors from generations past, all arranged as if attending a grand banquet that never ended. The Wexleys dined among them, their laughter echoing off the stone walls, their voices reverberating as though answered by something unseen. Servants who descended to clean or prepare the room reported hearing whispers in the darkness when no one was speaking. One footman claimed to see the candles burning brighter whenever the prayers began, as if the very air fed on the words. Another swore that he saw a dead woman's eyes move, following him as he served wine. When he tried to flee the estate, Edmund found him days later near the river, his body twisted in a way that made the doctors whisper of something inhuman. The ritual evolved further when Edmund took control after his father's death. Where Henry's faith in the ceremony had been rooted in fear and gratitude, Edmund's devotion bordered on mania. He expanded the crypt, hiring foreign laborers who never returned home. He lined the walls with human bones arranged in intricate patterns, claiming it strengthened the chamber's connection to the spirit world. He replaced the marble table with one made from dark oak, said to be taken from trees that grew upon an ancient burial ground. And unlike his father, he no longer viewed the rituals as offerings, but as transactions. He began speaking of bargains, of debts owed and debts collected, of ancestors who demanded more than remembrance. Guests were no longer welcome. The dinners below became private, attended only by Edmund, his sister Clara, and the silent dead who surrounded them. It was said that Clara wept through the meals, her sanity fraying under the weight of what they had become. Yet she continued to attend, bound by loyalty, by fear, or perhaps by something deeper that neither brother nor sister could resist. The line between the living and the dead blurred until neither seemed to know which side they truly belonged to. Those who approached the estate in later years claimed they could hear faint music coming from beneath the ground, not the lively melodies of human celebration, but low, drawn-out notes like a hymn for the damned. When the Wexley estate was eventually abandoned, locals spoke of strange lights flickering from underground on moonless nights, of voices murmuring in the soil as if the earth itself remembered the prayers whispered in the crypt. Those who dared to venture near swore they could feel warmth radiating from the ground, as though a feast were still taking place far below. And though time would crumble the estate above, the house of eternal company endured beneath, sealed away with its table, its relics, and the eternal guests who never rose from their seats. Edmund Wexley was born into darkness long before he ever understood what it meant. From childhood, he had been raised among the rituals that his father called sacred, watching the candles burn in the underground chamber and the shadows shift like living things against the walls. He grew up with the smell of decay masked by lavender oil, with the sound of whispered prayers instead of lullabies. Where other boys learned to read from books of history or poetry, Edmund learned from the blackened pages of the family's ritual texts, memorizing verses that promised wealth in exchange for remembrance, and remembrance in exchange for obedience. By the time he reached manhood, his mind was shaped by superstition and silence, his heart heavy with a loyalty that blurred the line between love and fear. When Henry Wexley died, no funeral was held. The townspeople assumed he had been buried in the family crypt, but none ever saw the coffin lowered. Instead, Edmund and his sister Clara locked themselves inside the estate for weeks. The servants whispered that strange noises echoed from beneath the floors, that the light of the dining hall glowed red through the cracks at night, that laughter and weeping mingled together in the dark. When Edmund emerged, he wore his father's ring and spoke with a calmness that frightened even those closest to him. He claimed his father was not gone, only waiting, and that the family's work must continue. It was then that the slow decline began. Edmund was not content merely to preserve his father's traditions, he wanted to perfect them. He believed the family's fortune depended on a deeper connection, that their ancestors demanded more than mere ceremony. He began modifying the rituals, spending long hours alone in the crypt, sketching diagrams of symbols that did not match any known language. Servants heard him speaking to unseen figures, pausing as though listening to replies. When questioned, he insisted he was consulting with his predecessors, learning their secrets. His eyes grew hollow, his hands perpetually stained with candle soot and wine. Clara, once gentle and soft-spoken, started mirroring his madness. She wandered the halls at night, whispering to the portraits as if they were her companions, her voice echoing through the corridors with a kind of mournful devotion. As months passed, the estate fell into isolation. The carriages stopped arriving, the letters ceased, and the gates rusted shut. The townsfolk avoided the road that led to the Wexley property, swearing that at dusk the air grew unnaturally cold near its borders. The few servants who remained within were kept by fear rather than duty. They said Edmund rarely ate during the day, preferring to dine only when the sun had set. He became thin and pale, his movements sharp and deliberate, as though every gesture carried ritual meaning. One night, the cook claimed to have seen him speaking to his father's corpse in the dining room, the body seated upright, dressed in fresh garments, its skin stretched and powdered to mimic the living. The cook fled before dawn, never to return. Clara's descent was gentler but no less tragic. She began writing letters addressed to the dead, sealing them in black envelopes and leaving them at the base of the crypt door. She spoke of her mother's voice calling to her in dreams, telling her that the family must remain together forever. Sometimes she was heard humming lullabies to empty chairs. Edmund encouraged her delusions, telling her that their mother's presence was proof that the ritual worked, that the Wexley fortune would never die so long as they kept faith. He told her that the dead gave them strength, that their ancestors demanded devotion through sacrifice. What kind of sacrifice he meant became clear soon enough. Servants began disappearing. The first was a maid who had served the family since childhood. Edmund claimed she had left to care for a sick relative, but her belongings were found neatly folded in her quarters, and her name was never mentioned again. Then went the gardener, then the stable boy. Each vanished without a trace, and each time the family's wealth inexplicably increased. Stocks rose, properties were restored, debts were forgiven. The city papers called it a miracle, but those who knew the Wexleys whispered that their prosperity was bought with something far more precious than gold. The mansion itself began to change. A sickness of the spirit seemed to infect its walls. Paintings warped, faces in portraits appeared to shift when the light dimmed. The smell of decay grew stronger despite endless attempts to mask it. The mirrors reflected rooms that no longer matched reality. Once, a visiting tradesman delivering wine swore he saw someone standing behind Edmund in a reflection, though the space behind him was empty. The man left his goods and never returned. As Edmund's obsession deepened, he grew convinced that the ritual had to be maintained with precision. He timed his meals according to the lunar cycle, burned certain herbs to purify the air, and forbade any mention of the family's dead, as if speaking of them aloud might break their delicate connection. Clara, fragile and exhausted, began to fear her brother, but lacked the strength to leave him. In her diary, found years later, she wrote that she no longer knew where life ended and death began within their home, that the voices of their ancestors had become louder than their own thoughts. One evening, the servants heard Edmund laughing deep within the crypt, the sound manic and echoing. When he emerged, he carried his father's ring and a new scar across his palm. He claimed he had sealed the family's pact in blood, that now they would never fade. From that night onward, he rarely spoke to anyone again. The dinners continued, but now they were silent affairs, conducted in the dark. Clara sat across from him, her hands trembling as she lifted her glass, her eyes fixed on something beyond her brother's shoulder. Witnesses from the village would later say that when the wind was right, they could hear faint music drifting from the estate, an organ's slow, mournful tune playing for guests no one could see. By the turn of the century, the Wexley name had become a whisper of madness. Their fortune remained untouched, their estates untouched by time, but no living soul was ever seen entering or leaving their mansion. Those who passed near it at night swore that the windows glowed faintly with candlelight, and that if one listened closely they could hear the clink of glasses, the murmur of voices, and the low sound of laughter that seemed to come from beneath the ground, as though the Wexleys were still feasting long after life had left them. When the doors of the Wexley estate were finally forced open in 1921, decades after anyone had last been seen entering or leaving, the air that spilled out was thick and stale, as though the house itself had been holding its breath. The authorities had come at the request of the city after the property taxes went unpaid and the estate had fallen silent for far too long. The outer gardens were overgrown, the wrought-iron gates strangled by vines, and the windows of the grand manor were so clouded that they reflected nothing but the grey sky above. The men who entered carried lanterns and axes, though none could explain why their hands trembled as they crossed the threshold. The silence inside was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of a place that remembered. Every footstep echoed too long, and the walls seemed to listen. The grand foyer was coated in dust, but beneath it everything remained intact, as though the family had simply stepped out for the evening. Coats still hung on the racks, silver still glinted faintly in the dim light, and the faint scent of lilies lingered in the air, dry and brittle like old perfume. The men moved cautiously through the rooms, finding traces of life frozen in place. An unfinished glass of wine on a piano, a chessboard mid-game, a quill left beside an open ledger whose ink had long dried. There were no signs of struggle, no hint of intrusion, only an eerie stillness that made each man speak in whispers, afraid to disturb whatever slept within those walls. When they reached the dining hall, they found the first horror. The table was still set for 13. The candles burned down to their stubs, their wax hardened into shapes like dripping tears. Around the table sat figures, 13 in total, each dressed in formal attire, their heads bowed slightly, as if in reverence. At first, the investigators thought they had stumbled upon wax figures, perhaps remnants of some grotesque collection. But when one of the men leaned closer, his lantern's light revealed skin that had long since withered, stretched tight over bone. The Wexley family had not vanished. They had never left. Edmund sat at the head of the table, his body preserved by methods the coroner later described as unnatural, almost impossible. His hands rested calmly on the table, and his mouth was curved in the faintest of smiles, as though frozen mid-conversation. To his right sat Clara, her hair silvered with age yet perfectly arranged, her eyes open and glassy, her body rigid but upright. Around them, the remaining seats were occupied by corpses of varying decay, men, women, and even children, some identifiable as long-deceased Wexley ancestors whose graves, when later examined, were found empty. Every guest of that macabre feast had been seated with ceremony, their clothes immaculate, their plates filled with food that had mummified rather than rotted. The table itself was an altar. Beneath it, carved into the wood and the floor below, were symbols resembling those seen in occult manuscripts banned from public libraries decades earlier. Candles arranged in circles had melted into thick pools of wax that clung to the stone floor like frozen blood. The walls were lined with portraits whose painted eyes had turned black with age, yet their faces seemed to shimmer in the flickering light, as though alive. At the far end of the room, a large mirror stood draped in a tattered black cloth. When one of the men pulled it aside, the reflection it offered was not of the room they stood in, but of the same table. Except in the reflection, the figures were moving. One of the men fainted. Another dropped his lantern, which nearly set the drapes aflame before being stamped out. The inspection was halted for the night, but even outside the men swore they could still hear faint music from within, a slow, mournful waltz that faded only with the dawn. When they returned the next morning, the air had grown colder and the scent of decay stronger. They continued their search, uncovering the passage that led to the crypt beneath the estate, the chamber spoken of only in rumor. The door to it was sealed, rusted shut. Yet the moment they broke through, a gust of air spilled out so cold that it extinguished every lantern. When light returned, they saw the House of Eternal Company exactly as it had been described by whispers. The walls were lined with bones arranged like patterns of devotion, the ceiling glimmered with crystal stalactites formed from decades of dripping wax, and in the center stood another table, identical to the one above. But here, the chairs were empty. On the table, 13 goblets stood filled with something black and thick, long dried but still glistening under the light. The plates were etched with names, each name matching a member of the family found upstairs. In the center of the table was a single open book, its pages fused together, though one word could still be read carved into the cover beneath layers of dust. Continuance. The coroner who examined the bodies later concluded that they had been dead for at least 20 years, yet the state of preservation defied every natural law. Some appeared untouched by decay, while others had deteriorated only slightly, as though time itself moved differently within those walls. The investigation that followed uncovered fragments of letters and journals hidden throughout the house, written by Edmund in his final years. He wrote of communion with the dead, of bargains fulfilled, of a hunger that could never be sated. He spoke of the dining ritual not as tradition, but as necessity, claiming that the family's wealth was bound to the feast, that their ancestors demanded companionship, and that death was only another form of presence. The estate was sealed by the authorities soon after, declared unfit for habitation. Yet over the years, those who lived nearby claimed the house never stayed silent for long. On certain nights, faint light could be seen flickering from the windows of the dining hall, and the echo of distant laughter drifted across the fields. Some said the air near the estate still carried the scent of lilies and burnt wax. Others swore that when they stood close to the gates, they could hear the faint clatter of silverware from deep within. The house was eventually swallowed by ivy and shadow, its roof collapsing in on itself, yet the ground around it remained untouched by decay. Locals began to call it the house where time stood still, the place where the Wexleys still dined, their fortune preserved in death as it had been in life, their eternal supper continuing far beyond the reach of the living.